Hey, that's too loud.
Okay, so we're gonna do our little review of the Quilter here.
Yeah, this is the Quilter Tone Block 200.
Yeah.
It's a compact 3-knob solid-state amp. It's 200 watts. I think it's Class D power supply, so it's super lightweight. What's it weigh? Like 8 pounds, maybe?
Oh, I wouldn't even be able to guess. It's so small and so light.
I want to say it's somewhere in the 8-pound neighborhood.
I would guess 5.
Maybe.
I'm not holding it right now. I just feel like it's really, really light. It's very compact. It's very loud.
Yeah. Well,
and I've got it set up here to AB against the Princeton.
Yeah, you've got it set at on the 10-watt setting.
Yeah, it's at 10 watts with the gain. What is that? Well, the gain starts at noon for the guitar setting. So the gain's got to be at like 20%.
Sure. I used this. We'll talk about how I used it a little later on.
Well, let me just give a sound comparison real quick. Here is the Quilter Clean. I'm using my SG with what are these pickups that are?
I don't know.
The Burstbuckers in the bridge.
Oh, the Burstbucker in the bridge, and is it the Dream 180 from GFS in the neck?
In the neck. The Quilter is running into a salvage custom guitar cab that has cream backs in it.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, and then the Princeton is just stock. It's a stock reissue.
Yeah.
The Quilter has an SM57 on it. The Princeton has an SM58 because I don't have multiple 57s.
Right, but they should be pretty similar.
Pretty close to each other. So here's the Quilter Clean. And here's the Princeton. They definitely have like a different voicing.
Yeah, we tried to EQ them as closely as we could, but because the Quilter is basically a contour knob, you're limited on your ability to, like, when you're turning the contour, like, you're raising the mids.
Yeah.
And that's it. Versus on the Princeton, you can change is it all 3?
There's only 2 tone knobs on there.
Is it just bass and treble?
Low and high, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you're right, bass and treble. So, I guess before we get too much into the demo, I'll talk about how I've been using this thing. I've used it for church, and I've used it for my surf band for live performances and for practices. I did 2 live shows with it, and I did 1 church show with it.
Okay.
And I think 2 or 3 practices with it. I've used it quite a bit and gotten very familiar with it. I've done a bunch of home stuff with it, obviously.
So the website actually says 4 pounds.
I knew it was light. It's very light, very compact. I gotta say, this is a very usable amp.
Yeah, when we say this thing's compact, it's
half a rack.
It's
space.
a half rack space. If you're not familiar with rack units, it's maybe about the size of like the Strymon Big Sky.
Sure.
In terms of footprint,
it's about as big as like a Super Nintendo.
I think it's smaller than a Super Nintendo.
You think it's smaller than a Super Nintendo?
Anyway, the point is it's really small.
What about a Sega Genesis?
Yeah, it's probably around the size. No, it's definitely smaller than a Sega Genesis.
Okay, it's around that size. It's like game console size.
Yeah, if you had like the Nintendo, the second version, not of the original NES, not the gray box, but the one that was like the cream and red box, it's maybe that size.
Gotcha. This thing is so loud, I can't believe it. It goes up to 200 watts. I feel like it's more like 300 watts how loud it feels.
So I don't know if this is true, but I read on a forum that these amps allow you to crank it to 200 watts. But then that's like 200 watts RMS, and it's a very loose reading. I don't know if this is true.
Okay.
This is just something I read. That this is actually a 400 watt amp.
Oh my
gosh. But you can only turn it up to 200 watts.
Oh, okay.
But instead of one of the things that makes this amp unique, and hopefully we can kind of demonstrate, is it's very responsive.
Very punchy.
Very punchy. It sounds great. but like if we dialed it in dirty and then played soft, like it's gonna clean up.
Yeah.
It's
It's got all
gonna
the
do different
normal
things.
like dynamics you get from a guitar amp.
Right. But the thing is normally, like, if you were to take a solid state amp, turn the master, which is basically what the wattage knob is, to 10,
You'd clip it.
and then like hit the guitar really hard, even with like the preamp down a little, like you would risk like clipping out and blowing the thing up.
Sure.
What I have read is basically that this amp, you can turn the master up to 200 watts, but it actually has a capability to go beyond that.
Right. So your peaks won't max it out.
Yeah, so the peaks aren't maxing out. So in that sense, it's behaving more like a tube amp, whereas like an AC30 crank or an AC30, 30 watts is the clean tone for an AC30.
Right.
But if you crank that thing up and you're digging in, you're putting out more than 30 watts.
Right.
Or
you're just pushing 30 watts against a hole that allows you're pushing more than 30 watts through a hole that only allows 30 watts through.
Right, exactly.
And that's where you get your clipping.
Exactly.
But with tube clipping obviously sounds better
smooth.
than solid state clipping. Generally in people's opinions.
Unless you have a tube screamer.
Right. Until you put it in a little box on your board.
Anyway.
Right.
So that's neither here nor there.
My opinion on this thing is that it doesn't sound like a tube amp. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it sounds like a really good solid state amp to me.
Yeah.
It definitely reminds me of using the acoustic 150. It's got kind of that dry, punchy, barky kind of sound.
Yeah.
Like a little bit of like a quack to it. The Princeton's got more of like a compressed, sweet sound. And that's a really useful sound to me when you're playing in a loud band. Like I feel like it really cuts through the mix well, especially if you're doing stuff with kind of like time-based effects like delays and reverbs and stuff like that. That stuff doesn't get compressed by a tube. It goes straight through basically.
Yeah.
So if there's a sound that you've dialed in with your pedal board or with a modeler or anything like that, at every volume you're going to get it exactly how you dialed in it at home.
Yeah.
Which is great. You know, some people just don't want that. I think there's people out there who are down on solid state because they're like, oh, it doesn't sound like my tube amp that I use at the blues club, and I crank it up and I push a booster into it to make it drive, and then I use a solid state with my booster and it didn't do that. It's like it's a completely different piece of technology. Like you're using it wrong if you try to use it like a tube amp. Is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But if you use it as a really great sounding solid state amp, then it's going to be great for you. So that's kind of my takeaway on it. How did you feel about using it?
So I rammed this. I took this and used it to play bass.
Of course, because you're a bassist.
Because I'm a bass player mostly. And so I'll start off by saying I've actually I've messed with it a little bit with guitar, and I think it sounds just fantastic with guitar.
Sure.
The contour knob is really functional, which it should be, but I feel like as an EQ for the sounds that I want, it's really good. All the way counterclockwise, it's kind of a Fendery mid scoop.
Yeah.
12 o'clock is a flat EQ contour. And then all the way clockwise is I guess a Marshall-y or a Vox contour.
It's like a British sound where the highs and the mids are pushed and the lows are kind of scooped out.
So, and then, you can use all the positions kind of in between if you want kind of like a mix of things on the sweep. So when I set this thing up for bass, I ran it straight up and down, 12 o'clock. I took the master all the way up to 200.
Right.
And I set the preamp volume or the gain
to line level,
basically as loud as I needed it to be. So I was actually running it at about 10, 11 o'clock, I would guess.
Okay.
which is actually about where I normally the amp I usually use is a Galen Kruger Backline 600, which is a 300 watt amp. I don't know why it's called the Backline 600 when it's a 300 watt amp, but whatever.
It's because they want you to buy two.
Yeah. But that's what I usually use. As a bass amp, I thought the Quilter sounded great.
Sure.
When I didn't really use the British setting because with the bass drop off, it just doesn't really sound great.
That's really not going to work.
The mid contour or like the middle position, the flat EQ, gave me a really just normal response, like what I usually try to get my bass to sound like, which is just everything sounds pretty even. The Fender scoop or that mid scoop sound I keep calling it a Fender scoop. I don't remember what they call it in the manual, but that's basically what they're going for.
Yeah.
It actually sounds really cool on bass. It gives you kind of that thumpy 60s R&B tone.
Oh, cool.
So think like Ampeg B15 kind of a thing.
Like something you'd hear like behind Diana Ross or something like that. Yeah.
Think like Flat Wounds or for me it actually just sounded a lot like what I feel like I sound like when I play with my thumb. It's just that real woody, almost upright bass kind of sound.
Gotcha.
Now, the one thing I will say, and I don't know if it's an issue with the cab I was using, which was a PV 1820 cab, but this isn't a great bass amp if you're doing like super low end heavy stuff,
like super modern sounds.
Right. If you're really wanting like a boo kind of a thing.
Yeah. If you want to shake people's teeth out of their head.
Yeah, it doesn't really. It gets loud, but it doesn't really have that big bottom end going on. But for what I was doing, like the real even response was really great. I tend to be a little more low mids and mids focused with my bass playing. So that worked out okay. The other thing was that it was a breeze to set up. The guy who I was playing with was like, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
We had kind of like a cool gear conversation with it. But, I mean, it was great. It took me 5 minutes to dial in the sound I wanted because it's so simple.
Yeah.
That it was a pleasure, and I'm kind of bummed that we're going to have to send it back.
Yeah, they've already given us the return shipping is taped to the box, so I'm probably going to send it back in the next week. But yeah, it's just been a lot of fun to play with. I'd say that if there's anything I would say I didn't like about it or change about it, is I know they're going for the super simple thing. I would love to have more control over the mid frequencies.
Right.
Like if they put a stacked knob on there that allowed you to have some mid control, that would go a long way for me.
More mids? Or I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'd like to be able to I guess it could be a control over the high too, because there's no setting on this where you get to dial down the high, which was my problem. Is that normally I run my amp pretty dark and then run bright things into it for my surf band. So I had to figure out ways to dial back the brightness on my board or on my guitar to not get ice picky on certain settings.
Yeah.
Which I was able to figure that out. I was able to get it to where I needed it to be. But if it was on the amp, then it would be easy for me to dial the highs back or dial the mids up to defeat the highs, So that's really where I was with it. Another question I have about it is why they use the knobs that click.
That was kind of a weird thing.
It's got a division click on there where each knob has 100 different clicks on it. And messing around with it, I was able to feel that in between the clicks, it is doing a sweep. It's not a hard click in the frequency. And I was able to actually trick it into sitting in between clicks for micro adjustments. But I wonder why they decided to use that kind of pot instead of a smooth pot. I wonder what the function of that is or what their thinking is. Right. Maybe they'll get back to us and let us know. Other than that, I thought it was great. if I owned one of these, I might figure out how to mount it into my pedal board or build like some kind of rack unit to carry it around.
Right. I felt like this amp is a great. It would be a great backup for anyone.
Oh, absolutely. If you're going on tour, you just throw this in the trunk of your car or in the back of the bus. If anything goes wrong with any amp, you can pull this out in a pinch.
For myself as a multi-instrumentalist, and by multi I
that
really
sounds
just
so
mean
douchey.
I know. Really just guitar and bass. But say you're in a touring band, or
Right.
like you're in a band and you want an amp, like you have guitar, bass, maybe you have keys.
Yeah.
Maybe you have, I don't know, something else.
You have a DJ booth.
Theremin.
Yeah. You have you run a real simple microphone situation. You run a single mic.
Yeah. You've got a computer that you're doing tracks from, and you need an amp that isn't going to take up a ton of space, that you can just pull out to replace. I used it for bass, totally happy. You used it for guitar, pretty happy.
Yeah, I would have no problem gigging with this all the time. For my surf band.
Yeah, I think this. I'm kind of saying like, oh, this would be like the perfect backup amp for anyone. But along with that, I would say that I think this is probably a great gigging amp for probably at least 2/3 of the guitar players out there.
Sure.
Like if you just have simple amp needs, which I think a lot of people do have.
I think most people do, whether they realize it or not. Most people, you don't actually need to have this super crazy amp with the tubes, done just right, and every EQ option on there. Most people need a 3-knob amp.
Yeah. So many...
Because the way we run boards now and effects and everything, you've got EQ settings everywhere. You got your voicing set on your board, and you really just need the amp to be your loud box.
Yeah, so many people are running like big boards, and they're always on drive and whatever. That I think that this amp could really work for them.
Yeah.
And I know we have listeners that are like, oh, but it's solid state or whatever, but I thought it sounded great.
Well, let's do a little bit of demoing with it. When we first posted that we got this thing and we were going to be doing a review, people basically asked us to do some tests with running fuzzes and drives into it.
Right.
With the thought that the downfall of a lot of solid state amps is that those things can be too brittle.
Sure.
Where a tube amp kind of naturally softens that stuff, and you get a more natural sound out of like a very gritty fuzz or overdrive. So I'm going to use the McCaffrey Audio Green Vodka down here, which is basically a Big Muff clone.
Right.
And I'll mess around with it on the Quilter, and then we'll go back and forth between the Princeton. And the Princeton is naturally a brighter amp, so it might actually sound a little bit grittier. The Quilter I found is, like I said earlier, it's kind of a barky kind of dry sounding amp, but I don't think it's going to be brittle. Let's see what happens. All right, clean signal. That was the Quilter, and then the Princeton, and then here's the fuzz here. That's the Quilter. That's the Princeton. The Princeton is brighter.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is tough about the comparison we're doing is that the speakers in the Salvage are just a lot beefier.
Oh, totally.
Than what are in the Princeton.
And also it's a different mic, so there are going to be things here that make this not fair.
Yeah.
But I think what we're really trying to listen for here is whether or not this is an amp that is handling, drives well.
Yeah.
Or if it's, doing some kind of weird thing that isn't guitar appropriate.
Right.
Like we're showing you that you can run a fuzz into this and it's doing something normal with it. It's not like some cheap solid state from Crate or Line 6 that's just going to sound really weird because it's too brittle or it's just a circuit taken out of, like something that should have been a low wattage PA or something,
Sure.
Like this is a guitar amp. This is a musical amp. Here's a light gain setting. I think that sounds great.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the Princeton real quick. Like the Princeton has more of, I guess, like what you describe as a more of a 3D sound, where there's more EQ depth going on there.
Sure.
But I think that's just because it's a lot brighter at these volumes. I have tube amps that obviously would be a lot darker than this.
Yeah, I think depending on how you're running your setup,
Yeah.
like you said, it doesn't sound bad. It just sounds kind of different.
Yeah, it sounds very different, but it sounds like a guitar amp. Like I feel like I'm getting more of like a Marshall-y sort of vibe
Right.
out of the Quilter. Let's try like a light overdrive. This is a pedal that we're going to be doing a review of in the near future.
Yes.
That there's a Kickstarter for. I literally, you open this up, you look at the number on it, it doesn't say 001, it just says 0.
Yeah.
This is the 0 number pedal of this. So we have basically the prototype. It is the Civic Crown Overdrive from FX.
Yeah. It actually has there's a name that goes with that. It's not just FX.
Yeah, the logo is too small for me to read it right here. Tailored FX.
Yeah, tailored effects.
So we're going to be doing a review for this soon. It's a really cool pedal. It's basically like a Tube Screamer voiced sort of overdrive with a 3-band EQ on it. Here it is. And that's out of the Quilter. And that was a Princeton. Here's what I got to say about the voicing, like the EQ difference between the Princeton and the Quilter. I feel like the Quilter is that kind of MIDI barky sound that is the kind of sound that actually cuts through the mix in your band setting. The Princeton, the tone we're getting out of it at these settings is gonna disappear in the mix a little bit more when you're in a band setting. And I love the Princeton. The Princeton's a great amp, but it doesn't cut through the mix as well.
Yeah.
Like this kind of mid bark that you get out of the Quilter, that's like your perfect band tone.
Yeah.
Like you're going to cut over the drums, you're going to cut under the bass, you're going to be in the mix, you know?
In the mix.
In the mix. I think it sounds great with a lighter overdrive. There's no like hard, bright clipping there.
No, not at all.
It sounds nice and smooth. The thing that's going to be missing versus a tube amp is that it doesn't have that hard compression at the top of your pick, you know? It's just clean punch. It's not like I don't have the Princeton up high enough to show the compression, but there's a little bit of like wah wah, you know, at the top of the pick. Yeah. Where you just got a little bit of compression, and you know there's people who really like that, and you really like that, then you get a tube amp. If you don't need that, then you can get a solid state and not have it.
Yeah.
But for me, for doing surf rock, it's just fine. I don't need to have that compression. Here, we'll throw a little reverb on here. My FRV1. Sounds fine to me. Here's a Princeton. I mean, they both sound good.
Yeah.
They're just totally different flavors.
I would say I'm listening to it. The Princeton it sounds like what the Princeton has always sounded like when you dial it in. The way the Quilter's dialed in right now, it definitely reminds me a lot of the acoustic, like you said before, or even kind of more like like your classic 50, I feel like you dial in a similar tone.
Sure.
Where it's just a little darker.
That's a darker amp than the Princeton for sure.
But, I definitely, I think really the take home is that, and this is something I've talked about before on the podcast. It's something that I've ranted on so many groups on Facebook, so many different forums. What Quilter is doing is they're saying, like, this is technology. How far can we go with it?
Yeah.
How good can we make this?
Yeah.
And they've made a really good product.
It's a workhorse, man.
It's, I think, $400.
Yeah. That's the part that's really nuts, is that you got this $400 thing you can use with any instrument. Like, this is with it dialed into the guitar gain setting. The line setting is basically just clear.
Well, it's all continuous.
There's just no gain on it.
It just is how high your gain needs to be.
And I've messed around with the gain, like turning the gain all the way up to get an overdrive out of this, because it does overdrive.
Yeah.
It's not incredible, but I don't think it's meant to be your main gain. It's meant to simulate an amp that's being pushed a little bit.
Yeah, it's very much at least on the settings that I tried it where I did that, it's very much like a master volume Fender crank.
Sure.
Where it's like, it's an okay drive, but it's not. And maybe it's your flavor, but for a lot of people, I don't think it will be.
And if you want an amp that has tube like overdrive, then just get a tube amp.
Yeah.
If you are running your drives all from pedals, then you're fine. You don't need to worry about it, You don't need to have an amp that drives well unless you're pushing the tubes for some reason.
Yeah.
And that's, people talk real big talk like, oh, I need to push my tubes. How often are you actually doing that? At home, you're not doing that unless you've got a 5-watt amp,
Right.
If you're doing it at your gig, if you're, depending on the size of your gig, you're either blowing away the first row or you're not loud enough because your amp isn't, the right wattage for the situation if you're playing a random venue. For studio stuff, you can dial in that stuff a little bit better, but it's, there's a lot of variables with tube amps that I don't spend the time trying to deal with it in a live setting, just because it's tough to get the exact sound that you want at the volume you want in a random venue that you don't know the acoustics of it,
Yeah.
So that's kind of my little rant on tube amps. And one of the reasons why I've been a big fan of the acoustic and of kind of vintage solid state is that you're going to get what you get at every volume, basically, So that's the strong point of solid state. Is there anything else we want to say about this thing?
I don't know. I don't think so. Like I said, I think they're worth checking out. I think if you're on a budget, if you have a cab already, this has a direct out. If you're in a situation where you need to run direct, I kind of have like the predecessor in a familial sense, not to this
in a conceptual sense.
In a conceptual sense,
yeah, it's not family related in any way.
No, which was the Crate Power Block, which came out like maybe 10 years ago, and the biggest difference between these two is that the Power Block is noisy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it does have some like line noise issues in my experience with it. The Quilter's dead silent.
Yeah. Well, it's we're getting a little buzz here, but I can't tell if that's from the Princeton or not.
I think it's from the Princeton.
It doesn't sound any louder than any other amp I've ever used. I haven't noticed its sound, so that's all you need to know. I had a lot of fun with it at church. I ran it direct out and to an amp at the same time.
Yeah.
And that was really useful and really fun because I used the amp to monitor my tone and to kind of get my amp tone out to the audience.
Yeah, and you use the direct out so the sound man can turn you off.
Exactly. So the sound man could feel like he had control to turn me all the way down. But yeah, it's just a super useful tool. It's, like I said, it's limited in its EQing. But you could throw an EQ on your board, like a 10-band or something, and get more control over that.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a light amp to grab and go, I think it's great.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a clean amp to be really loud, I think it's great. I don't have any like damning complaints about this thing, basically.
No way, man.
Yeah. So let's wrap this up. We got a song, right?
Yeah, we got a song from Donnie Coyle.